Hey, Stockholm. Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here. My name is Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep on Twitter. And I'd like to begin today with a story about New York City, but not as we know it. To do so, we actually have to go back a few hundred years to the last years of the 18th century. Because at that time, New York City was actually a fraction of its modern-day size. Its population hovered around 125,000 people. Now, that might not seem like very much, but the overwhelming percentage of that population was actually concentrated around the southernmost tip of the island. North of that point, however, there were these privately held, expansive estates that sprawled for miles on end. So what we're really talking about here isn't a story about one New York, but two. Two cities with vastly different living conditions, existing side by side, but not really coexisting especially effectively or well. And what's more, around this time, there was a surge of immigration, so that southernmost tip of the island was actually proving unsafe and unsustainable. It's proving incredibly difficult for the city government to police the area, to provide fire control. Even preventing the spread of disease was proving challenging. So that's why in 1807, the New York government formed what was known as the Commission of Streets and Roads to design a new comprehensive street plan for Manhattan. And they appointed a man named John Randell Jr. its chief engineer and surveyor. And working alongside some equally talented people, his team studied the land, they walked it, sometimes twice in one day. And after 4 years of this hard work, they produced something that I think is breathtaking. They produced 3 copies of a map, each one of them 3 meters long, and defining New York City's now famous grid street layout. But if we put the artifact aside for a second and the aesthetics, what they actually designed from the scope of it is frankly magnificent. Because they took this irregularly shaped jumble of plots and knotted streets and normalized them. They created a system of 12 named or lettered streets running north-south, parallel to the island, each intersected by 155 streets crossing them east to west. In other words, they designed a kind of life-size Cartesian coordinate system accessible both to old and new residents of the city alike. This is a talk about web design, I promise you guys. But the reason I love this story is because there's a kind of magic to maps and to map making. They provide a sense of boundary and of scope. We can explore a territory that once felt foreign to us, and we can try to understand where its landmarks are and their relationship to each other. And we chart down what we know. We create this thing, this map or this globe or what have you, that we can bring back into that territory that was once so uninviting and foreign and make it seem a little bit more like home. I'm fascinated by maps because I think there's an analogy to the work that we do on the web on almost a daily basis, right? I mean, each project that we design and launch and build is like a little map that we make of a problem that we didn't previously understand. We try to understand that problem, we try to understand its contours and its problem areas, and we try to set down a solution that's going to make it more accessible, not just to us and to our businesses, but also to our audiences as well. And if we take all those maps and we start stacking them together, we're basically building, as an industry, a map of the web as it's defined today, right now. The problem is that our view of the web has been so narrow for so long because we've been so focused on a relatively slim view of what the web actually is, just designing for a handful of desktop browsers. But then, as the saying goes, mobile basically broke everything. But it didn't really break anything. Mobile demonstrated to us that the control that we told ourselves as digital practitioners that we exerted over the web, that control was a consensual hallucination. A little bit of a lie, if I'm being less diplomatic. And the zombie apocalypse of devices that Karen talked about first thing this morning is now upon us, and we're keenly aware of device fragmentation as a design initiative. Our audiences want access to our sites and to our services wherever they are and whenever they are. And we've striven to meet them first with device-specific experiences and then sometimes with a more holistic, more device-agnostic approaches. Well, one of those approaches is something called responsive web design. This is an article that I wrote some 5 years ago now for A List Apart. And in it, basically, I argued that rather than seeing the flexibility inherent in the web as some sort of limitation, we can create wonderful, flexible experiences that can be used to design beyond the desktop to devices that we don't even know about today. So that's some fine philosophy, but it's been a weird couple years for me because I really just wrote an article. I hit a publishing deadline, and I wasn't expecting the reception that responsive design got. Across many industries, designers and brands and publications and companies that I respect and admire, taking the very basic ingredients from that article and designing digital experiences that are frankly kind of breathtaking. They're experimenting with the flexibility at the heart of responsive design, or maybe more accurately, at the heart of the web, and telling wonderful stories and making their sites and their services accessible to more screens, to more devices, and to more people than they ever did before. So if every project is like a little map that we make, I thought it'd be helpful to actually walk through a specific responsive layout, just to kind of talk a little bit about the mechanics of how these can be used to create more flexible and more accessible experiences. Because in the article, I basically suggested that there are sort of three front-end components to make a layout responsive. Every responsive design begins with a foundation of a fluid grid with images and media that work within those flexible layouts. And then finally, media queries that allow us to reshape that flexibility and channel it in interesting ways. So as a quick example, I mean, this interface is a great example of the two key ingredients of a responsive design that begins with a layout that doesn't have a single pixel involved in building this grid. Everything is sized in proportional terms. So as this viewport resizes itself, as the browser changes its shape, the pixel values of those columns and elements will change over time, but the proportions that were originally designed remain intact. Of course, this is kind of ugly, right? I mean, there's a reason the flexible layouts got like such a bad rap for so long. I mean, nobody wants to look at these on a massive monitor or on a small one. But we can use that flexibility as our foundation and then make it responsive on top of that. So every responsive design is basically, that I've worked on in the last couple years, has started with something like this. You know, a single column, mobile-friendly layout by default. This is basically a single column grid, a very simplistic layout. But then we can layer on media queries to tell the design how it should adapt at certain breakpoints to make it useful both to us and our organizations, but also to our users and their devices. So working from this single column layout, we can start making the browser window just a little bit wider and look for opportunities where we can enhance the design and introduce a breakpoint at a certain area to move to a two-column layout. But we can also make minor corrections as well. We can promote elements out of the footer, for example, in that smallest view, and put them up in the masthead once we have a little bit more room to do so. And then we can kind of repeat the process, right? We can sort of make things a little bit wider still and look for those other opportunities where we can enhance the design further and move to a three-column layout at a width of around 44 ems. My colleague Stephen Hay refers to this as kind of like an additive sculpture. Right? That as you're increasing the browser window, you're looking for those opportunities to enhance the design, to make the layout more complex. The thing about responsive design for me is it's not about taking a desktop-specific design and sizing it down to smaller screens, although that's a really nice side benefit. Responsive design is about acknowledging the fact that there's no one true layout for your interfaces. And what's more, we're at a point now with the front-end technologies that we have, we can build visual systems and grid layouts that are effectively infinite. We can create compelling, customized experiences on both the smallest screen as well as the widest one. You're really only constrained by the amount of time and resources your organization wants to spend on building these responsive layouts. And what's more, as you start working on more complex responsive designs, I think your teams are going to find out that this old notion of a page that we borrowed from graphic design, that wonderful object that we used to design for, is really kind of more and more outmoded when we're thinking about building more complex responsive designs. More specifically, I found it helpful to think about our interface as basically a network of small layout systems. The individual components that comprise these larger responsive works all have their own rules for layout and design and also for adaptation. They change at their own pace, kind of independent of the ones around them. But then once we have those rules sort of encoded, we can then stitch them together to loosely bind all these layout systems together to build more complex layouts up from those smallest parts. Here's a really quick example. Like let's say we were designing a masthead or a toolbar inside of this application. And so viewed on sort of a wider screen, it might be a fairly traditional taskbar with some central text in the middle and then some buttons on the left and the right. But that's just one view of this layout system. Because below a certain point, it dramatically simplifies itself to a list of 5 or 6 links. Now, while the layout might look simpler, the features and functionality have remained exactly the same. This isn't about mobile users getting less information or desktop users getting more. It's about presenting the same tasks and functionality and content to users regardless of the size of their screen. And so planning the design of these small layout systems is a fairly straightforward process, regardless of whether you're building, let's say a content-driven page or maybe something more interactive like this toolbar. Your process begins not with layout, but with thinking about content priority and relationships. So for this toolbar, we basically started by looking at all the tasks and features that we were going to include in this layout system and then try to group them together, basically creating menus that could be treated as buckets that we could then move around the design as things got sufficiently wide. So for example, moving from this very modest foundation, we could then introduce a breakpoint above a certain widescreen level to simply take those buckets, those discrete little chunks of the toolbar, and position them off to the left or to the right. But it's not just playing sort of a shell game and moving elements around. We can also look for opportunities to make better use of the space available to us. So we could take elements out of that submenu and make them visible by default and drape them over the middle of that toolbar, making them accessible when we have a little bit more room to play with. Now, the question that often comes up, if you read CSS, for example, is like, well, where do these breakpoints come from? How do you decide when these layout systems need to adapt? And that's not dictated by any specific screen size or screen resolution, but rather the needs of the content and tasks inside the layout systems themselves. So for example, this toolbar, below that measurement, below that breakpoint width, that central piece of text, that key piece of information starts to get a little bit crowded, potentially clipped by the buttons that appear on the left and the right. So in other words, as you're designing these responsive layouts and these interfaces, think about these breakpoints as a way to defend the integrity of your content, to ensure not that it just fits on certain device classes or screen sizes, but that it's always a pleasure to interact with and read regardless of the size of your screen. So this is really a perfect example of what Mark Bolton is talking about when he thinks about content out design. And Microsoft.com's responsive homepage is a beautiful example of this. The grid system isn't tuned to the width of the browser window or of a specific display, but rather if you spend any amount of time with this responsive layout and resize it, you're going to notice that every single piece of information on that design always feels tuned to its ideal width and height. So you have elements, for example, like that Discover menu on the left that'll move from a vertical list of links to a horizontal one, and then sometimes back again. They're introducing breakpoints tuned to the needs of these small layout systems to make sure that they're adapting and legible regardless of the size of the viewport that's actually rendering them. So this is a little bit wonky, but the reason I love this more module and content-focused view of a responsive design is that our rate of acceleration beyond the desktop is only continuing. We're going faster and further than ever before. And so we're basically still building that map of the web with sites both device-specific and responsive. And as we build more visual languages to do this, it's an incredibly exciting thing. But the thing is that our work is only beginning. Because as it stands right now, I think our map is far from complete. Broadly speaking, there's been a lot of excitement from a business standpoint about how responsive design can actually benefit your bottom line. And some organizations have been really vocal about what they've learned and gained from adopting responsive. A couple examples in particular were the Boston Globe, who I worked with a few years ago on a responsive layout, and then two e-commerce sites, o'neillclothing.com and skinnyties.com. Now, the Boston Globe basically said that their new responsive presence was directly related to a massive spike in digital subscription sales 6 months after launch. O'Neill Clothing basically saw that iPhone transactions more than doubled and Android transactions more than quadrupled in the new responsive experience over the old desktop-specific one. But it's not just about mobile versus desktop. Skinny Ties and other organizations that I've spoken with found that revenue growth, conversion rate, and visit duration dramatically improved across every device class that touched that new responsive experience compared to their old one. So slides like these, I love showing off, right? I mean, because these are very impressive looking numbers, and we like showing growth to stakeholders, and this is great. But to be fair, there's been a little bit of murmuring in the underbrush. Some suggestions that maybe responsive design's not all it's cracked up to be. And in fact, maybe there's a little bit of trouble in paradise that we need to talk about. Here's a quick example. This is moto.oakley.com, and this is a stunning piece of responsive work from an aesthetic standpoint, from a technical one. They've translated some really complex animation and layout schemes into a completely flexible, completely fluid canvas. This single page, however, weighs 6 megabytes. So many of you in this room probably have MP3s on your phones that are significantly smaller than this website. This is an old version of tnlax.com, a beautiful boutique design for a studio based in Canada. And I loved this responsive site because if you spent any amount of time on this, you'd see all these wonderful little details around the edges as they told the stories not just about their work, but about their design process. But depending on where you were in the site, any one of these pages would range in size from 3 megabytes to 21 megabytes. So it's sites like Moto.Oakley and TN Lax that have led people to say things like this. I think we have to face the music. Responsive design makes it hard to write a fast website. Them's fighting words, guys. Come on, grab your pitchforks and your torches. You know, this is going to be fun. Now, just to be clear, I mean, Guy Pajari's done some invaluable research and writing about, the technical challenges in front of designers and organizations who care about performance but are also interested in responsive design, as I think we all should be. But this is a common sentiment that comes up. There's a suggestion out there that there's something fundamentally incompatible with responsive design and creating fast, easy-to-download experiences. And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. But I'd actually argue the problem extends beyond responsive design itself. Here's a quick example. This is internet.org. This is a fixed-width design. This is actually an interesting campaign. This is an initiative started by Facebook to help people in developing countries get better access to Facebook. I'm sorry, I meant the internet. This one page, I'll be here all week. This one page weighs 4.3 megabytes. This is Apple's Mac Pro promo site. I said that without stuttering. I'm very excited. This is cinematic, beautiful work. I mean, as you move down the page, photographs fly out of the darkness at you, and they turn into cross sections of themselves the further you go. I mean, this is really just evocative, visually stunning stuff. This one fixed-width page weighs 33.4 megabytes on a non-Retina display. So I think it would be very easy for me, standing up in front of you, my friends, to basically say, to look at internet.org and Apple's promo site and basically say something like this. I think we have to face the music, guys. Fixed-width design makes it very hard to write a fast website. I'm officially trolling. But there is this larger problem on the web that we do have a weight issue with our work. Because not 6 years ago, the average weight of a web page weighed 320 kilobytes. And as of this year, this month, the average size of a web page is well over 2 megabytes. The problem with that is that while Moore's law has been charting all these wonderful increases in every aspect of personal computing, our devices, our processors, their storage keep getting more powerful every year. But the one area that's fallen down completely is bandwidth. And that trend is only continuing. As I was working on this talk, I came across the work of a man named Alfred Korzybski, who was a philosopher and writer working in the middle of the 20th century, and he was fascinated by semantics, by the languages and words and pictures that we use to communicate on a daily basis. And this one idea that sort of gripped his imagination was this idea of a rhetorical divide, the distance between an object and a representation of it. Quick example. Let's say I asked you to tell me about your morning cup of coffee, or tea, if that's more your thing. There's no judgment here. You could tell me anything about that experience, the taste of it, the smell of it, the way that it felt in your hands. You could talk quite literally for days on end, and some detail of that moment would be left out. That moment is uniquely yours, and language can never bridge that gap. So this is what led Korzybski to coin this phrase, that the map is not the territory, that there is a fundamental disconnect between an actual thing, the territory, and the thing that represents it, the map. Which, whatever, philosophy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it seems a little self-evident when you look at it, right? That when you're looking at a map, you're obviously not looking at the territory, you're looking at an abstraction, a sketch. 3 dimensions have been sort of flattened down into 2, kind of violently. But it's a connection that I think we fail to make sometimes. And Korzybski actually thought so too. He was concerned that we were so focused on the map in front of us that we'd forget to actually look up and take in the complexity and the difficulty of the territory that it represented. I mention this because I think we might do this on the web, at least a little bit. That so many of our discussions around the state of responsive design, about web design in general perhaps, are really framed in decidedly Western terms. And if we start looking past the map that we've drawn in front of us, we might actually find that the territory of the web is actually a lot more complicated than we might like to think. Here's a quick example. I mean, when you hear the phrase mobile, a few things might come to mind. But the one thread that I hear most often is that these are archly personal devices, right? This is my device. It's always on, it's always online. It's my view to the internet in general. But if we look a little bit further afield, the picture is much more complicated than that. If we went to Bangladesh, for example, this is a fascinating region of the world to me. Thanks to some massive deregulation in the mobile market, they've seen massive adoption of mobile data in general. In 2011 alone, the number of mobile internet subscribers jumped by over 900%. And even among the poorest citizens of the country, mobile use is incredibly popular. But the thing is that these devices are very frequently not personal. In fact, there are whole networks of sidewalk vendors who rent time and data to people who are unable to buy the devices themselves. And this isn't isolated to Southeast Asia. If we turn our attention slightly west to Africa, which is a wonderful example of a nearly mobile-only ecosystem, a tenth of its landmass is pretty much covered by mobile internet services. And they have saturation rates higher than most anything we ever see in the developed world. In fact, it's frequently said that more people in Africa have access to a cell phone than to electricity. But the thing is that they've actually leapfrogged our view of the web because we've been yoked to the desktop for so long. I mean, mobile financing and payment systems in sub-Saharan Africa are far more advanced than anything we have in more developed countries. And again, very frequently, these devices are not personally owned. They might be a communal resource shared among a village, or they might be leased to somebody who can't afford the data themselves. Now, this is changing. In the last couple of years, smartphones have gotten much more popular, but we have this explosive popularity of slower, low-powered devices that are reshaping for these people what the mobile web actually is, or what the web is in general. Now, I know what you're thinking. I see a lot of crossed arms, a lot of skeptical looks. Maybe it's the end of the day, but maybe you're thinking to yourself that these aren't my users. I don't have to be designing for use cases like this. And I think that's probably very true today, but I think in the near future, they're going to be your users. There's been a significant amount of writing and research about how the mobile web is effectively relocating itself today, this year, where the lion's share of data demands aren't coming from more developed markets anymore, but from much younger, less developed economies. But if we put geography and demographics aside for just a minute, it's actually kind of interesting because Ericsson's done some research to suggest that at the end of last year, of all the mobile data connections that were estimated to be in use, a full 60% of them are on sub-3G networks. So that's why I'm wondering if maybe we're building a little bit of a digital divide. We are designing today, this month, this year, some of the most beautiful work, responsive or not, that's ever been unleashed on the web. But I wonder if it's not necessarily ready for a web as it's becoming, a web that's far more broadly accessed than ever before, but also far slower and far less reliable. Now, it's easy, at least for me, to sort of do some of this research and write off some of these developments as unique to developing ecosystems, that eventually this is going to be solved by time, right? That a rising tide will lift all boats. But again, I wonder if we're maybe seeing the emergence of a new normal for the web, a web that's defined by shaky data connections and low-powered devices, but still being held by people who want access to our sites and our services. So I think that begs the question, how does that change the way we think about digital design today in 2015? And also, are we ready for them? If you'll permit me, I'd like to actually return just really briefly to Randell's map, because I think there's one more thing it might be able to teach us. Because there are actually a lot of parallels between New York at the end of the 18th century and the web as it exists today. There was a large population consolidated at the foot of the island in unsafe living conditions, compared with those expansive, privately held estates to the north, those entrenched interests. And Randell's map was trying to design a balance between those two. The interesting thing about maps, though, is when you think about them, they're usually the result of like a documentation effort, right? You explore a territory, you try to understand it, and you chart down what you know. But Randell's map was trying to establish a vision for a city that didn't actually exist, a vision for New York that could better serve its residents through design. And there's actually this one line that I desperately love in their mission statement before they actually set out their work, that their map should basically unite regularity and order with the public convenience, and in particular, to promote the health of the city. You don't often see poetry in civic documentation, but I think that's a wonderful line. And I wonder if it's a question we could be asking ourselves more often as we think about the design of our products and services. In other words, how are we designing interfaces in a way that promote the health of the web? And that's a scary question. But I think we're at this point now where we need to move beyond just adapting our layouts to fit differently sized screens and actually design responsibly and also sustainably in a way that's going to promote future growth for this much slower web that I think is actually emerging right now. So at least for me, when I think about sustainability, I think of these sort of two underlying concepts: reduce and revisit. And reduction is the one that often comes to mind when we think about front-end performance, right? We need to reduce the size of our pages, make them download faster. But the challenge is that performance is often seen as a technical problem. And in fact, it's actually everyone's responsibility on your team. And one of the best tools for actually thinking about bandwidth at the outset is this idea of a performance budget that was actually designed by Clear Left a couple years ago. And basically helps your team set down a definition of what constitutes good design from a performance standpoint at the beginning of a project. And that could be in terms of page weight, or maybe something more user experience driven. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that once you've established that budget, every creative decision and every content decision is seen through that lens. So that as you prototype and you're adding new elements to it, if anything causes you to exceed that limit, then it's worth having a hard discussion about what has to be optimized or perhaps even removed to bring you back in line with your performance budget. But the one other thing that I think we need to also revisit as we're thinking about the speed of our work is this old concept of progressive enhancement, about ensuring access to our content and our services independent of the experience around it. And this has been the hallmark of every responsive design that's been published in the last few years, especially above a certain scale. The BBC have just recently relaunched their responsive news project, and it's a wonderful example of this. Because if you're on a reasonably modern browser or device, you'll actually see all these little UI niceties, like tabs and expandable menus. But that's just one view of this responsive layout. Because below a certain threshold, if you're a less capable device or maybe a network condition fails, you're left with a responsive experience. Yes, it's completely flexible, but it's a little bit different. Those tabs are just links to separate pages where the content resides by default. Those expandable menus bring you to the bottom of the page where they might live in those less capable devices. So what we're really talking about, again, is sort of two views of this one responsive design: an incredibly fast baseline experience that's served to every browser on the planet, and then a slightly more enhanced version of the same exact content that's served to the devices and browsers that benefit from it. Now, I love the process that they use to actually think about which browser gets which experience, and it's basically this process they call cutting the mustard. Does your browser cut the mustard, sir? It's wonderful. The thing I like about this is that they've basically made a commitment to load just enough code in their pages to see if the browser will actually benefit from more code. So they ask a very simple question and a little bit of JavaScript to say, are you sufficiently modern enough to benefit from those more enhanced versions of that same UI? And if it is, great. It loads in extra files to power that experience. But if it doesn't, you're still left with something incredibly fast and incredibly accessible at the end of the day. The benefit to progressive enhancement is it allows you and your organizations to manage a ridiculous amount of complexity in the browser and device marketplace. The BBC, for example, doesn't have to track individual platforms and devices. They can think about the responsive design as existing in one of two incredibly broad experience tiers. In other words, this is a grand scale of letting go of the need to control the experience perfectly. And I think it's a wonderful way to proceed. Now, that's not to suggest that progressive enhancement is the only solution to some of the challenges we have in front of us in the next few years. I think it's another tool in the box, and I think it's an incredibly valuable one. But I've been thinking a little bit recently about this one moment that I read about with Charles and Ray Eames, who were some of the preeminent American designers in the middle of the 20th century. And they were known for many, many achievements. But one of their earliest was designing affordable but high-quality furniture that was accessible to the American consumer for the very first time. They brought design into the United States living rooms. And there was this air of functionalism throughout all of their work. It was breathtaking, but it was all eminently usable. But they were able to lower costs and make it more accessible because they used cheaper, maybe lower quality materials that were kind of derided by a lot of their contemporaries. Things like aluminum, plastic, or fiberglass. But the thing is that their use of these lesser materials wasn't sort of tucked away behind a clever bit of upholstery. It framed the design. It was the design. So there's this one line that I desperately love by Ray Eames, who said, "What works is better than what looks good. The looks good can change, but what works, works." There's something about that. Because I think we're at this point now in responsive design's evolution, or maybe the evolution of the web in general, where maybe we need a new definition of beautiful as it applies to our work. One that's not just defined by aesthetics or interaction, but also measured by how broadly our work is actually accessed, and one that also embraces the fragility of the web, this powerful, beautiful thing that we designed for. We have the ability to combine lightweight materials and responsive design to create incredibly compelling and incredibly accessible, flexible experiences. Now, these sites that I'm showing you aren't necessarily the norm just quite yet, but they're wonderful proofs of concept that we can design for reach and accessibility by default, but still intelligently chart a path up to that higher end of the experience spectrum that we're all really invested in as digital practitioners. Because yes, we are builders, we are designers, we are developers, we are product owners and product managers, but we're also cartographers, or map makers. We're capable of outlining a territory, but also reshaping it as we see fit with the projects and services that we design on a daily basis. And that's an awesome responsibility. But it's also a bit of a gift. So as we come to the end of this beautiful day and prepare to leave this wonderful, wonderful room that we're all sitting in, let's maybe begin thinking about sketching a new map of the web together. One that's designed for access and reach, accessible by all, no matter what part of the territory they may live in. I'd like to thank you very much for your time.
Surely this crowd have much more routine on this than I have, but I just want to say that I'm impressed because I don't think I've ever seen a faster keynote presentation. Wasn't it really great?
Well, thank you. I try to cramp my thumb during the course of the session.
Well done.
Yeah.
I can come up with hundreds of questions of what you're saying.
Okay.
Let me try one or two and see also if there is any flow into Annika, if you have any. Firstly, the responsive design is a challenge, obviously. Is there a device that is more important than the others? I mean, which device has been the real challenge for responsive design concept?
That's really interesting. Challenge is a good word because I think in many ways the devices that we use on a daily basis are a bit of a challenge, like the latest iOS device or the latest Android device. I mean, those are incredibly powerful, wonderful experiences, but at the same time, they're not necessarily representative of less capable environments or browsers that might be accessing our work. So I think it's incumbent on designers and developers that, if possible, moving past our comfort zones. Our view of the web doesn't necessarily always match the way in which our audiences are interacting with it. So for me, at least, I like seeking out devices that are actually, they feel a little bit less capable. When we were working on the Boston Globe, we had the significant amount of their audience were using old BlackBerry devices, which could access content, but not really much else. So it was actually a really great design exercise to think about that as our starting point, and then sort of enhance up to more capable environments from there. So.
Do we have anything, Annika?
Yes. Someone asked if there are any other fields than the furniture where you can get inspiration from.
Oh, man. I've only got 2.5 minutes, but I mean, so just the top of mind that comes is, responsive design borrows its name from this sort of emerging field of responsive architecture, right? So that there are architects that are dealing with a crisis of their own, with changing climates and collapsing economies, and they're looking at ways to create spaces that can adapt to the needs of the environment around them, or also the people that might actually be occupying them. And there are people that are coming up with walls, for example, that are actually kind of flexible. They can sense the proximity of people approaching them, and they can change their shape a little bit to allow more people into the room. It's a bit of a drastic approach, but I'm really interested in sort of seeing that transition because I think we're going through something very similar on the web.
I'm not sure even that I fully get you perhaps did, but I may be too stupid. I fully get what you mean with the new normal
Right.
that you mentioned.
Okay.
What's the consequence of the new normal?
Well, I mean, I think that most of my clients and a lot of the organizations Karen McGrain and I talked to on our podcast, they're really starting to recognize the business benefits of thinking about performance, the speed of their work, not just the aesthetics or the interaction models around it. So getting them to talk about how that experience needs to be much more slower, how it needs to be consumed over, like, let's say, a less capable network connection. That's, I think, a really big challenge right now. And I think that this, looking at demographics in further flung parts of the world from us, is a really great exercise to sort of have that reminder that the web needs to be a little bit slower sometimes.
Okay. Ethan, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. And thank you for coming to us. You also had a great workshop yesterday.
Yes, I had a great time.
He's delivered. Ethan Marcotte. Thank you very much.